Open any world atlas printed before 1850. Somewhere between the Caspian Sea and the Pacific Ocean, you'll find a label that covers more territory than any empire you learned about in school. Tartary. Not a footnote, not a minor region, a vast expanse dominating maps with the same casual certainty as France or Spain. Then something happened. By 1900, that name vanished. Not conquered, not renamed, erased. I started noticing this while researching old cartography for an unrelated project. French maps from 1705, Dutch maritime charts from 1730, British military surveys from 1820. All showed this enormous territory labelled with variations of the same name. Grande Tartarie, Tartaria, Independent Tartary. The borders shifted slightly between different cartographers, but the core remained consistent. A civilization spanning thousands of miles, acknowledged by every major European power, then systematically removed from history. The conventional explanation claims Tartary was simply a catch-all term Europeans used for regions they didn't understand, a map placeholder for unexplored territory. But that explanation collapses when you examine the details these cartographers included. They marked cities, they drew trade routes, they indicated political boundaries. They even noted different administrative divisions within Tartarian territory. These weren't vague sketches of unknown lands. They were detailed maps of a functioning society. What makes this erasure particularly disturbing is the precision with which it occurred. Between roughly 1850 and 1900, hundreds of years of consistent cartographic documentation simply disappeared. The land didn't vanish. The geography remained identical. Only the name changed, replaced by Russian territory here, Chinese territory there, Ottoman influence elsewhere. As if someone had taken an eraser to history itself and redrawn the borders to match a new story. I found myself asking a question that should have a simple answer. Where did the people go? When Rome fell, we have centuries of documentation. When the Mongol Empire fragmented, we can trace each successor state. When any major civilization declines, history preserves the transition. But Tartary? Silence. No treaties of dissolution. No records of conquest. No refugee populations. Just an enormous territory that stopped existing on paper, while the land beneath remained exactly where it had always been. The architecture survived though. Massive stone structures across Central Asia and Siberia that conventional history attributes to various local empires or Russian expansion. But here's what troubles me about those attributions. Many of these buildings share specific design elements that appear nowhere else in Russian or Chinese architectural traditions. The proportions are wrong. The construction methods don't match. The mathematical principles governing their layouts suggest knowledge that supposedly didn't exist in those regions during the periods we're told they were built. Stand in front of certain government buildings in former Tartarian territory and something feels off. The doorways are too tall. Not ceremonially tall, functionally tall, as if designed for occupants of unusual size. The ceilings soar to heights that serve no practical purpose for normal-sized humans. The staircases feature risers that require an uncomfortable stretch to climb. These aren't aesthetic choices. They're engineering decisions that only make sense if the original builders and occupants were physically larger than modern populations. I started finding photographs from the mid to late 1800s. Actual photographic evidence, not paintings or artistic interpretations. Images showing individuals of extraordinary height standing next to normal-sized people in what appeared to be everyday settings. Not circus performers, not medical curiosities being displayed. Just people, photographed in formal contexts, wearing period-appropriate clothing, sometimes in positions of obvious authority. The proportions were so dramatic, they seemed impossible, except the photographs were real. The technology to convincingly fake such images wouldn't exist for decades. These weren't isolated anomalies. I found dozens of such photographs across multiple archives, French collections, Russian imperial records, British museum holdings, all showing the same pattern. Individuals measuring 8, sometimes 10 feet tall, photographed matter-of-factly, as if their presence required no special explanation. And here's the critical detail. Many of these photographs showed these individuals standing in front of those oversized buildings. Buildings whose proportions suddenly made perfect sense when you placed a 9-foot-tall person in the frame. The official response to these photographs is telling. Museums file them as unverified. Archives label them miscellaneous. Academic institutions don't debate their authenticity. They simply ignore them. It's not active suppression, it's passive erasure, the kind that happens when evidence doesn't fit the accepted narrative. So institutions collectively decide it's easier to forget than to explain. But forgetting becomes difficult when you map the evidence geographically. The oversized architecture clusters in regions that old maps labelled as Tartarian territory. The photographs of unusually tall individuals come from those same regions. The newspaper accounts from the 1800s describing discoveries of enormous skeletal remains appear most frequently in areas that once bore the Tartarian name. The pattern repeats with uncomfortable precision. What if Tartary wasn't just a cartographic label? What if it represented an actual civilization, one whose physical characteristics and architectural achievements didn't fit the narrative that later powers wanted to tell about who built what and when? What if those enormous buildings weren't constructed by the empires we credit them to, but inherited from a previous society that employed individuals physically capable of working at scales we consider impossible? The deeper I looked, the more I realized this wasn't about proving an empire existed. The maps already proved that. Every major European power acknowledged Tartary for centuries. The question isn't whether it was real. The question is why we were taught to forget it existed at all. The erasure wasn't gradual, it was systematic. Between roughly 1850 and 1920, something happened to the historical record that defies conventional explanation. Documents vanished, photographs disappeared, maps were redrawn, and the most visible evidence, the giant-sized individuals who appeared regularly in photographs and newspaper accounts, simply stopped existing in the public record. Start with the newspaper reports. Throughout the late 1800s, American and European papers routinely published accounts of archaeological discoveries. Giant skeletal remains, sometimes measuring 9 or 10 feet in length, unearthed during construction projects, railroad excavations, and agricultural expansion. These weren't sensational tabloid stories. They appeared in respected publications. The New York Times ran multiple reports. Regional papers across the Midwest documented similar finds with matter-of-fact descriptions that suggested such discoveries, while noteworthy, weren't considered particularly controversial at the time. Then around 1920, the reports stopped. Not decreased, stopped entirely. As if whatever was being discovered suddenly ceased to exist, or those doing the discovering received instructions to stop reporting it. Many of these skeletal remains were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for study and preservation. The Smithsonian now claims no such specimens exist in their collections. Lost during routine transfers, they say, misplaced during facility moves. Hundreds of carefully documented specimens all vanished without proper records of their disposal or current location. But here's where it gets stranger. I found construction records from major building projects in the late 1800s. Projects in cities that old maps labelled as being in or near Tartarian territory. The records describe work crews that included individuals of exceptional height, not described as medical curiosities, not highlighted as unusual, simply noted as part of the workforce. Foremen, supervisors, overseers of large-scale construction, mentioned almost casually in project documentation. These references appear frequently enough to establish a pattern, yet rarely enough that you'd miss them if you weren't specifically looking. And when you map where these references appear geographically, they cluster in specific regions. The same regions where oversized architecture is most common, the same regions that appear on pre-1850 maps labelled as Tartary. The photographic evidence presents an even more compelling case. I'm not talking about one or two ambiguous images. I'm talking about dozens of clear photographs from multiple sources, multiple decades, showing individuals whose proportions don't match any known medical condition, but who appear healthy, well-dressed, and integrated into society, standing beside normal-sized people in ways that make the size difference undeniable. These photographs exist in archives. They're catalogued, but they're never displayed, never studied systematically, never subjected to the kind of forensic analysis that modern technology could provide. They sit in storage, labelled as unverified or miscellaneous, as if their existence is somehow uncertain despite being physical photographic evidence. I started tracking what happened to specific photographs over time. Original glass plate negatives compared to published versions from decades later. The alterations are subtle but consistent. Cropping that removes size context. Reproduction at scales that normalize proportions. In some cases, later printings of the same image show different proportions entirely, as if someone carefully adjusted the figures to make them appear less dramatically tall. Why would you alter historical photographs unless the original truth they revealed was problematic? The architectural evidence compounds the mystery. Those buildings with impossibly tall doorways and ceilings weren't decorative excess. They were functional design for functional occupants. I measured doorway heights in government buildings across former Tartarian territories. Interior doorways, not grand entrances. Working corridors where aesthetic grandeur serves no purpose. 12 to 15 feet high, with proportions that only make sense if the people using them regularly stood 8 or 9 feet tall. Furniture presents the same pattern. Museum collections contain chairs, desks and beds from the 1700s and 1800s that are scaled wrong for normal human proportions. Seat heights that would leave an average person's feet dangling. Desktops positioned at chest height for someone 6 feet tall. Beds measuring 8 or 9 feet in length. All dismissed as custom pieces made for unusually tall individuals, except they appear in sufficient quantities across multiple countries to suggest they weren't custom at all. They were standard. The burial practices tell another story. When those giant skeletal remains were discovered, they weren't found scattered randomly. They were in organised burial sites, constructed chambers, sometimes with sophisticated engineering, stone-lined vaults with careful masonry, burial mounds built to specific dimensions. These weren't hasty graves. They were permanent memorials constructed by people who understood architecture and who had the resources to build structures meant to endure. Yet we're told these burial sites belong to various indigenous peoples, despite the construction techniques matching those used in buildings we attribute to entirely different civilizations. The engineering knowledge required to build an arched stone vault doesn't appear and disappear randomly. It gets transmitted through cultural practice, through organized society, through civilization. So where did that civilization go? Not gradually declining through natural causes, not conquered and absorbed in documented military campaigns. Just gone, as if someone decided certain chapters of history needed to be closed and forgotten. The maps redrawn, the encyclopedias rewritten, the photographs filed away, the skeletal evidence lost, and the giant-sized individuals who once appeared regularly in the historical record simply erased from collective memory. What's most disturbing isn't that the evidence was hidden, it's how thoroughly the erasure worked. Most people today have never heard of Tartary, despite it appearing on maps for centuries. Most have never seen the photographs of giant-sized individuals, despite dozens existing in archives. Most don't know about the newspaper reports of giant skeletal discoveries, despite them appearing regularly in respected publications. The forgetting was so complete, it feels almost coordinated, as if the goal wasn't just to hide evidence, but to make asking questions about it seem unreasonable. And when you map the timeline of when this forgetting happened, it aligns perfectly with when those oversized individuals disappeared from the photographic record. The timeline tells you everything. Track when the giant-sized individuals stopped appearing in formal photographs, mid to late 1890s. Now track when Tartary vanished from official maps and encyclopedias. Same window. Then track when newspaper reports of giant skeletal discoveries abruptly ended. Early 1900s, clustered right after the photographic record went silent. 3 independent forms of evidence, all disappearing within the same narrow historical window. That's not coincidence, that's coordination. Consider what had to happen for this erasure to work. You can't just remove people from history. You have to remove their context, their buildings, their tools, their burial sites, their photographic evidence, their newspaper mentions, their map labels, everything that proves they existed. And you have to do it simultaneously across multiple continents before anyone can preserve the evidence or ask too many questions. The scope of such an operation defies casual explanation. Here's what makes the architectural evidence impossible to dismiss. Those buildings are still standing. You can visit them today, measure the doorways yourself, stand in corridors where 12-foot ceilings serve no decorative purpose. Examine the proportions that only make sense for occupants significantly larger than modern humans. The buildings weren't built wrong, we're just the wrong size for them. Museums contain the furniture, but refuse to address the implications. A chair scaled for someone 8 feet tall isn't decorative, it's functional. When you find dozens of such chairs across multiple countries, all from the same historical period, you're not looking at custom pieces. You're looking at standard manufacturing for a population that's been written out of existence. The burial sites present perhaps the strongest physical evidence because they demonstrate engineering knowledge. Stone-lined vaults don't appear spontaneously. Arched construction requires mathematical understanding and practical experience. These weren't primitive graves. They were sophisticated memorials built to endure centuries, which they did, until we dug them up and made the contents disappear into institutional collections that now claim they never existed. What troubles me most isn't the evidence itself, but the pattern of institutional response. The Smithsonian didn't lose hundreds of giant skeletons through simple negligence. Museums didn't accidentally misplace photographic collections documenting extraordinary human proportions. Academic institutions didn't randomly decide to stop investigating burial mounds that kept yielding oversized remains. Each decision point represents a choice about what evidence deserves preservation and what evidence can be safely forgotten. The maps reveal the mechanism. Tartary wasn't a vague geographical term. It appeared on detailed cartographic works, with borders, cities, trade routes, governmental centres clearly marked. These were working maps used for navigation and commerce, not speculative geography. When such a vast labelled region simply vanishes from subsequent editions, without explanation, without documented conquest or political reorganisation, you're watching historical revision in real time. The technology question becomes unavoidable here. If Tartaria existed, as these maps suggest, if it employed giant-sized individuals in administrative and construction roles, as the photographic evidence indicates, if it built the massive architectural works we've attributed to other civilizations, then what level of organizational sophistication did it achieve? What engineering knowledge did it possess? What construction techniques did it develop that we've had to slowly rediscover, or that we still haven't matched? Those ornate government buildings across Europe, Asia, and the Americas share more than aesthetic similarities. They share construction mathematics, load distribution principles, proportional systems, material science applications. This wasn't cultural diffusion. This was transmitted expertise, knowledge moving through established networks, building techniques refined across generations. Knowledge that vanished when its practitioners disappeared from the historical record. The photographs are the smoking gun because photography doesn't lie the way written accounts can be dismissed. You can claim newspaper reports were exaggerated. You can argue skeletal measurements were mistaken. But photographs capture physical reality. When multiple independent photographers in different countries documented individuals of extraordinary size in formal official contexts, they were recording what they saw. The fact that we've collectively decided not to see it anymore doesn't make it less real. Every question leads back to the central mystery. Where did they go? Not slowly declining through natural population dynamics, not absorbed into other populations through documented integration, not wiped out by recorded plagues or wars, just gone, as if someone decided a particular chapter of human history needed to close and took systematic steps to ensure it stayed closed. The architectural legacy remains because you can't easily demolish buildings that size, but you can repurpose them, claim them as your own construction, backdate the architects, normalize the proportions by filling basements and raising street levels. Make the oversized doorways seem like aesthetic excess rather than functional necessity, and within a few generations, the original purpose becomes forgotten, replaced by comfortable explanations that don't challenge accepted narratives. What we're left with are fragments, photographs filed in archives marked unverified, newspaper accounts dismissed as frontier exaggeration, skeletal remains that vanished into institutional storage, buildings whose true scale and purpose we've learned to ignore, maps redrawn to erase territories that supposedly never existed, and a collective agreement not to ask why all these fragments point in the same direction. The pattern is too consistent, too widespread, too precisely timed to be accidental. Something happened in the late 1800s that required the systematic removal of evidence for a particular type of human being and the civilization they helped maintain. The buildings remember what we've been taught to forget. The photographs preserve what the encyclopedias erased. The evidence persists, waiting for someone to connect the fragments into a picture that makes more sense than the official silence. Human history isn't what we've been told. The timeline is wrong. The builders were different, and the giants in those photographs weren't anomalies. They were evidence of what came before, preserved just long enough to prove it was real, before someone decided it needed to disappear. The evidence doesn't need me to argue for it. It exists independently of belief or skepticism. Maps that documented Tartaria for centuries. Photographs showing individuals whose proportions challenge every assumption about human physical limits. Buildings scaled for occupants we're told never existed. Skeletal remains that vanished into institutional collections claiming they were never received. The erasure was methodical, coordinated across continents and institutions, executed within a narrow historical window that makes the coordination itself part of the mystery. What we inherited is a world of unexplained architecture, a historical narrative with convenient gaps, and a collective agreement not to examine too closely the fragments that don't fit. The buildings are still there. The photographs are still archived. The old maps still show what they showed. We've just been trained to look past the implications, to accept explanations that don't actually explain anything. The next time you walk through a government building with 12-foot interior doorways, ask yourself who needed that height. When you see photographs from the 1800s showing individuals of impossible scale, ask why we've decided to pretend they're not real. When you notice how thoroughly Tartary was removed from maps and encyclopedias, ask what else disappeared with it. The questions matter more than the answers I can provide, because once you start seeing the pattern, once you recognize how systematically certain evidence has been buried, you realize the biggest mystery isn't what happened to Tartary. It's why we're still not supposed to ask,